complete story on whether the pen is indeed mightier than the sword. Our two teams will meet in a grueling duel of wit and witticism, and each will attempt to disarm the other with clever conclusions and winning witticisms. With each verbal thrust and parry, you'll see whether it's the students whose final I's have been dotted and T's have been crossed, or whether the professors will be the ones with holes in their argument. But now, let's meet our competitors. First on the professor's side, we have Dr. David Egan, PhD from BC, has 3 degrees, and is HOT. Before you write this guy off, be informed that he's not only an award-winning playwright, he studied language at Oxford and is familiar with Wittgenstein, if you know what I mean. Oh, sorry. It's a Wittgenstein joke for anybody who's taken philosophy of language. Dr. Egan is teaching Tech 2, which is confusing because he's the only one teaching the course. Also Tech 2. I'll leave now. Next we have Dr. David Lazinski, often touted as the paragon of masculinity. His work has included modeling flames in zero gravity because the Earth just wasn't hot enough to handle him. Dr. Lazinski enjoys numbers, but don't let that fool you. He has a 95% chance of winning this debate and is ready to dole out an even, perhaps even a normal distribution of fun and fact. First on the students' team is Kate Sinclair. Her stunning good looks and sparkling personality mask a rapier wit and biting sarcasm. When she's not crushing her opponents in debate, Kate can be found lifeguarding in her hometown of Markham, Ontario. Though she may look calm, savvy, and impeccably well-dressed, she's just waiting to unsheath her well-honed tools of rhetoric and logic to cut down the opposition. Her partner in rhyme is Michael Hewlett, a Winnipegger who puts the man in Manitoba. Famous for polishing bricks and being able to run 2 miles. It's on his Facebook profile. Michael's dashing good looks make him well-suited to dash his opponent's hopes to pieces. A man who looks as good in person as he does on paper, Michael will be punning and penning his way through this debate in fine form. Here are the ground rules. Each team will begin with 8 minutes of opening speeches to be divided between the 2 teammates as they see fit. There will be 2 rounds of 5-minute rebuttals on each side, for a total of 20 minutes. Following that, the floor will be open for 15 minutes of open fray debate, where each side can jump in with their arguments at any time, and we'll end off with 5 minutes of closing statements on either side. So, we'll start with opening statements. Each side will draft their arguments before putting the double underline under their thesis. We'll have each side sort out their response to the question before coming to their final point. This is a debate for the brave-hearted. Only the lords of the debate rings can master the debate, pirate their opponents' premises, and be the stars of this war. Be prepared for a verbal joust of epaic proportion. Debaters, you'll be debating the following resolution. Be it resolved that the pen is indeed mightier than the sword. Professors, you are arguing for this resolution. You have 8 minutes. How at you?
Should I jump up and just do the PowerPoint? Okay, so I'll talk for 4 minutes. I was told that I've been advertised as hot, which is why I ran here. Proving also that the pen is mightier than the QEW in rush hour. My students will know that I do very long, drawn-out PowerPoints. This one only has 2 slides beyond this one, you'll be pleased to know. Presumably the topic of this debate is normally thought of as a question, a sort of metaphorical question. Is the written word, the power of ideas, is it mightier than the force of arms and violence? But I want to begin by quite literally addressing the question, is the pen mightier than the sword? And you might think that I'm treading on dangerous ground here, because obviously, this is one thing that surely the swords have in their favor, that, if I were to whip out my bit here, and one of these two were to whip out a broadsword, who would win? I invite you to take a look at this, though, the world's largest pen. Horatia Pali. It is 16 feet long, 1 foot wide, weighs 40 kilos. I would challenge any swordsman to face me down while holding that. The other point I think is worth making in terms of pens being mightier as simply as weapons is to ask, who are the most fearsome weapon wielders in the world? The first one that came to mind was this guy, James Bond. And you'll notice that there are 5 different films in which pens are used as gadgets. There's explosive charge-firing pens in GoldenEye. There's the pen that explodes when you click it 3 times. How many swords feature as gadgets in the James Bond films? I think you'll find the answer is 0. So that's another point, and that's the end of my PowerPoint. You'll be thinking. But I'm not done yet. Another question in terms of who are the most fearsome warriors in the world. You could point to hardened criminals. And where do you find the most hardened criminals? Well, you find them in maximum security prisons. And in maximum security prisons, how is violence doled out? It's usually doled out by means of a shiv, or a makeshift knife. Often concealed razor blades. But I would put to you that probably you'll find that pens are used as deadly weapons in maximum security prisons far more often than swords are. Which would suggest that if you ask the most deadly hardened criminals in the world what their weapon of choice would be, a pen or a sword, I think for the most part you'll find them opting for the sword. The pen. And because I came here late, I'm now working off notes, but I will fill the next 2 minutes by shifting tack slightly to first of all, is it mighty? I mean, there are many ways we could talk about might. I want to suggest, again, as the person who's teaching a course on technology and society, that a pen is simply a far superior piece of technology. You'll notice that to this day, pens are very useful. We're all, I think, carrying pens. Oh, you've got a pen, so well. It'll be washed away within days, whereas I think that despite the fact that we're living in a day with handheld devices and data storage, most of us rely almost on a day-to-day basis on a pen. For the same reason that books will survive the Kindle and all the rest, it's simply that they're very good technology. They're lo-fi, they're cheap, they don't break down or run out of batteries. You can carry them around anywhere. And if you ask yourself in terms of simple, straightforward technology, how are swords doing? I think you'll find that the sword is not a big feature in any of the contemporary battles, and I think while the pen can still stand up to a handheld device, a sword is not going to last long against M1A1 Abrams tank. And so while the technology of killing other people in violent and gruesome ways has left the sword as an obsolete relic of history, I think we'll find that the pen, as an implement for creating deep thoughts and writing things down, is still going strong. I've used up 4 minutes, so I think I might pass it on to Dr. Lazinski and let him jump in. And I'll remember what I was going to say.
I'll just pick up where you left off. You said some of the weapons of the world, and the pen as a weapon itself. It's not just a physical weapon itself, but it's a pen that creates these weapons that he's describing. I mean, you can put yourself back in the 40s. Imagine a phone call to Enrico Fermi. They're putting together a Manhattan Project. I mean, figure the call is going like, hey Enrico, yeah, we're trying to build this bomb thing. We think you think it'd be great help. Why don't you come down to Los Alamos and bring a sword? Yeah, we've got this. We've got some refined plutonium. We're gonna whack it up with swords and sticks until we work out the bomb. So, oh, and you got a cutlass. That's great. Well, Oppenheimer's got an axe. We'll win this war. And the damage by the pen, but really the most effective damage is done through the writing of the pen. And I don't just mean hurtful words and phrases, or lies, rumors, innuendos, and spread rather rapidly worldwide. But pens can do this. That's a signature. And if that doesn't scare you, maybe you haven't seen a great Geico commercial where you got ninja dressed in black leaps out, fantastic swordplay, very very threatening. The dojo master pulls out a pen, signs a receipt, picks up the box, opens the box. It's got a taser. Apparently ninjas taser rather well. But those signatures can follow underneath words like I owe you $700,000. And there might be an asterisk with a footnote saying that $7,000 payable at an adjustable interest rate appropriate to a subprime mortgage. And with these pens, you're going to start creating these pieces of paper until you have several hundreds of billions of dollars of subprime mortgages. And then other guys with pens, they take these pens and they start drafting these structured credit instruments. And they give it to these other guys with pens. And these guys with pens, they push their pens, do rather some dubious math, and they say, oh yeah, these are AAA, they write AAA. And now with that, these pieces of paper written by pens get spread worldwide. They're sort of weaponizing this thing at a global level. And these signatures, they'll work in any language. You can do the signatures in German, you can do it in Spanish, in Italian, in Greek. And these things are spread far and wide until one day, one person listens and says, you know, I don't think that house is actually worth $700,000. And the other guy says, oh, that's okay, they can't pay that money anyhow. And the whole weapon is triggered. And with that, you wind up with $500 billion of write-downs of subprime loans, $1.5 trillion written down globally, $5 trillion of housing value lost, and the annihilation of $2 trillion in retirement savings. Try doing that with a broadsword.
You have 30 seconds.
Do I? Okay, then. By the way, the department wanted me to mention if anybody's interested in financial mathematics. Take some money to destroy the world, lots of fun. Give me a call.
I think the students really felt the tip of the argument there. Now, arguing in broad strokes that two blades are better than none, here are Kate and Michael.
Well, to everyone who is here to watch this debate, I would like to thank you for spending your time and effort to come and cheer us on. And I would also like to thank the Davids in advance for their valiant but futile attempts to win points. Now, my esteemed co-anchor and I will be arguing that the sword is in fact mightier than the pen. And we will be doing this using arguments of revolution, language, sex, culture, and of course, ad hominem attacks. Because the sword will always be against the man. While our slice and dice argument may seem at times cutthroat and at other times humorous, I would like to remind you all that like the mighty samurai wielding his katana, our sharp tongues will not be sheathed until we have sliced through weaker arguments. For today we defend our honor, and where better to start than with the weak, the vasectomized, the students. Yes, in fact, no case better outlines the might of the sword than that of the Canadian educational institution. I would like to invite you all to think back to October 31st of 1998. It's Halloween, and you're somewhere between kindergarten and grade 4. And you love Halloween because it means candy and costumes, and dressing as Conan the Barbarian. Yet before you're allowed to enter your class, waving your sword around in a frenzy of sugar-induced highness, your teacher confiscates your sword. And the repression begins. You're outraged, but you're impotent because you don't have a sword. Why? Clearly, they're afraid of what students can do with a sword in hand. Throughout the years, this repression continued, and now these men, these teachers, even in an educational institution that tries to tell us to be more enlightened, to think, to reach our full potential, are now trying to convince us that the very instrument of our superiority is inferior to a thin plastic tube bought in any dollar store. Yes, like moths to a zero-gravity flame, you have all Kate and I are here to pull the plug, or better yet, as Jeff would undoubtedly say, cut the cord. In the spirit of revolution that Alex Ramirez put forth, I would like to ask, yes, his green-suited mascot handed out 5,200 flyers, making it statistically impossible to for first-place votes. But how much more effective would his mascot have been if he had been handing out flyers at rapier point?
Ballpoint, the fountain, the crow quill, and the felt tip measure up to the rapier, the flamberger, the katana, and the scimitar. Which would you rather, Pentel or Excalibur? One does not simply pick up a sword at Staples. The Radisson does not hand out complimentary swords. Swords are to be earned in battle, pulled out of stones, plunged into enemy breasts, and preserved in legend. The sword is a luxury item, with a long history and cultural significance. It's the pen that writes about the sword, not the other way around. Fencing manuals, as far back as 1746, describe the majestic sword as being of enormous length and breadth, heavy and unwieldy, designed only for chopping by the force of a strong arm. If it looks heavy, it must be heavy. The troubadours of yore didn't sing about pens. They didn't even use pens. Real poets memorized their immortal legends. These are to be written, reenacted, and remembered. But let's really plunge into the heart of the issue. The pen is mightier than the sword. When I think might, I think raw power, sex, energy, mustiness, and taut, ripe muscle. When I think pen, I think mathlete. The two just don't compute. I mean, when you type swords are hot into Google, there are inevitably a lot of hits. I mean, you have your typical, warriors with swords at www.sheknows.com. And there are your fetishized warrior princesses, hot elf chicks with swords, and the paraphernalia at www.hotmovieprops.com. I can only imagine what you would use that for. Anyway, I tried typing in pens are hot into Google, and it was, you can imagine, much less thrilling. www.hotpens.com tried to sell me a brief bag and luxury fountain pen for a whopping $550. Now, while that might well appeal to a thespian like yourself, David, I have to tell you, outside of the ivory tower, it's really not that seductive.
And I would now like to draw your attention to the meat of this argument, that the sword is indeed mightier than the pen. Now, undoubtedly, we all know that Daniel Karenski has quite a mind, and as such, we've prepared a series of sexual quips of why the sword has bedroom dominance. You are free to interpret my meaning as you will. First, a pen is only allowed to scribble on the surface of a page, and must bring its own ink, whereas a sword does not ask before it plunges and thrusts into a warm body, and draws the blood it is given. Second, an exploding pen is something of an embarrassment, and without adequate protection in your pocket, you will sport stains shame for all to see. But to be blunt, should you find yourself in the naked company of another, prepared to do the deed, pen is not an adequate term for your penis. If you consider your sexual instrument to be similar to a pen, you are taking your work home with you. And no, Dr. Egan, quill is no better. Ladies and gentlemen, the bedroom is where even the quietest among us can display our full might, not by twirling pens, but by dancing with swords. Violence, rapture, honor, these are all similar qualities that pens and swords share. So save your wrist cramps for pens and solo fun. The sword is the mighty tool of real conquest.
So, speaking of role-playing, from Gladiator to Pirates of the Caribbean, cinema is obsessed with a time before guns, when you are required to beat your enemy face-to-face with a badass piece of metal. I don't remember Mel Gibson waving around a compact fiber-tip pen. Gandalf didn't bequeath any pens to anyone. And if I remember correctly, the Knights of the Round Table didn't sit around constructing box plots and making plays. The highwayman was not brandishing a .5mm ballpoint. It's not the quill of Gryffindor or nibs of Fury or a Klink's master fountain pen. Men who bear swords are warriors. Keep the pen in the pocket protector because that's where it belongs. Now, we did a bit of searching on Wikipedia. There is a 30-page article on famous swords. We tried to find such a page for pens, but unfortunately, it does not exist. Now, a word gets added to our arsenal, no one bats an eye. But when a weapon gets added to our world, the entire dynamic of society changes. I'd like to remind you, it's not the age of turpentine-based ink. The Bronze Age, the Iron Age, these are the turning points of our history. Now, David. Did David slay Goliath with a pen? No, he didn't do it with a sword either, but the point is, I can see how Marcus that your pen is a weapon, but I assure you, all of that red fluid it's ink. It's not blood.
That's all the time we have. That concludes our opening statement. It's time for rebuttals from either side. We'll see who's dazed and distracted and who's been staying on the ball for all. We'll start with the students. You have 5 minutes. Fire away.
Oh, we're going?
Yep.
Oh.
Well, if I'm going to jump in there, I'm going to talk about what it seems to be a glorified novelty pen that Dr. Egan discussed at the very beginning, which was weighing 40 kilos and could somehow be expected to beat any kind of broadsword or rapier in battle. Now, I may have sight perception incorrections, and from this distance, but is your arm really capable of carrying a 40-kilo pen? If that may have been, then you must have been lifting weights and not pens.
Also...
Or I was lifting that pen, actually.
Okay, Dr. Lozinski, I'd like to ask you, I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that, you know, a financial mathematician is the one reminding us that, you know, the signature is worth so much. I think that that's only true for, you know, you. Because my signature is not worth that much. And, you know, with a sword, I think we can really, you know, chop the hand that's doing the signing. How much is that worth? So, I don't know.
Jumping back, Dr. Egan, you stated that pens were cool and mightier because 007 has found inventive ways to take something normal and benign and make it interesting. Now, I would like to ask you, is this book not made infinitely more cool by the fact that it conceals a laptop? But this does not mean that all books are infinitely more cool. This is what...
It's just one book.
It's just one book. It's not even a book. A pen that explodes, a pen that shoots tiny bullets at people, that's not a pen, that's a miniature gun.
And really, I mean, the cool part of that pen is, like, the attachment on it. It's not the pen. It's, like, you know, the sweet, like, small little gun thing.
It's like someone liking you for your car, but not for your personality. It's rude.
And I think, you know, you said you can only have deep thoughts while holding a pen, but, I mean, we're not holding pens, are we? I have
Therefore.
Not only that, I mean, I can't count the number of times I had a deep thought sitting and stroking my
Jumping in, Dr. Lindsay, at the beginning you described the creation of different bombs and mass weapons using the pen, but that's similar to saying that because a professor creates great students, that for some reason the professor is great on their own.
Also,
I'm just going to leave
and also, I mean, going back to this signature business, which I find very bizarre. I mean, like, let's go back, you know, rewind a little bit. I think you did history. Did you do history?
Me?
Yes.
No.
Wrong Egan.
My brother, yeah.
Well, anyways, I'm sure you can tell you. You know, I think, you know, everyone came back from the Munich Accord feeling great with, you know, their little, you know, signatures. And really, like, I think we could just rip that paper apart. And wasn't it Hitler who said, you know, that was just, you know, words on a page? I don't remember the quote, but it's out there.
Persuasive.
I would just like to address the point that you insinuated that the economy is run by pens, and signatures led to more signatures, which led to contracts and checkbooks and balances, and eventually the fall of the economy. Most of the economy is actually run online through advanced computer programs. That's most financial mathematics, the department of which, Master, you're a founder of. And to say that the modern economy is run by pens is similar to saying that the modern army is run by swords. It's not quite that. I would say both of them are outdated in this case.
Also,
Sorry,
I
I'm
mean,
serious.
your prison comments. First of all, I'm sure you've never been to a prison. You have no idea what they're considering.
30 seconds.
Maybe you have, but and also this idea, you know, that that these are the true weapons. But I would argue those are dirty weapons, and we're talking about knights here. We're not talking about some ruffian, God knows where, right? So I think it really comes into question how you define might, and I wouldn't say somebody in a high security prison is mighty, but I think King Arthur.
Let's hear it for the students. Professor, you're up next. You have 5 minutes.
Okay. All right, just to rebut a couple things. From the opening statements of our esteemed colleagues, mention the movies, how they won, Mel Gibson, Gandalf, the Knights of the Round Table. Let me point out, in each of those movies, they won because the scriptwriters said so. You just have the scriptwriter hold out some coffee, and you got a quite different ending for Gandalf and company. You mentioned the pens. Pens write about swords. Swords don't write about pens, but indeed the sword, I would suggest, the sword is somewhat ineffective without the pen, without the words being created. You marshal armies, but you marshal armies to ideas, to concepts, to things being expressed. You don't say, yeah, we'll lay down our lives and fight for you because you got a shiny stick. It's the sword, in fact, doesn't even exert that influence directly. You run somebody through with a sword, lop off their head. They're really hard to influence after that. It's the threat of the sword that does it. The threat is conveyed by the pen. I mean, you can imagine you're putting together a rebellion, and they're sitting around, and the leaders look at the group and says, "Well, where's Bob?" And one of the guys says, "Well, I saw him coming. His green jacket is on his way, and this guy rode by on a horse and lopped up his head with a sword." I said, "Well, that's terrible. Why do you do that?" "I don't know. He wasn't particularly communicative." He stuck an edict to our door with a dagger, but he didn't have a pen. We have no idea what was up there. So okay, everybody, it's new rule. Nobody wears a green jacket, and we'll continue on with the revolution. Without the pen, the sword is left rather ineffectual in that manner. In fact, to really convey a threat, you don't even so much need the sword or any weapons whatsoever. For instance, I mean, you could make up, I'm just speculating here, some story about, I don't know, weapons of mass destruction. And it's quite possible you might not even actually have these weapons. All you've got is a few creative pens and a very vivid imagination, and pretty soon you get the whole world beating up on these people that probably don't have weapons. They have probably something else, I don't know. Oil, for instance. Swords. They've got swords. It was Napoleon that said, 4 hostile newspapers are more to be feared than 1,000 bayonets. And I would suggest even that pales to 1 pen in the hand of a bit of an overzealous CIA group. That's all.
Should I jump in?
I don't know. How are we doing on time?
You have 2 minutes.
2 minutes? Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, first I want to begin with a bit of ad hominem. First of all, Kate was asking me what the power of my pen does in all my teaching, and I'd invite you to reconsider that when you get your grade at the end of the day. Reassess whether there's a dangerous weapon then. And similarly, referring to our esteemed colleague Daniel Kerensnezowski there as Darren, I would suggest that perhaps a little literacy training might have. I was actually quite struck, especially from Kate, the emphasis on the might of the sword as a kind of phallic symbol. And I was left wondering what it is that you guys are trying to compensate for. Anyone who proudly swings this around has nothing to apologize for. Because I want to defend our namesake, I should also add, not only did David not need a sword to kill Goliath, But he's also mostly known as a great poet, and if you see images of David, he's far more often holding a pen than a sword, and is probably the most famous figure in the Old Testament as a result. Which brings me to the further point. I mean, you guys talk about all the great swords and swordsmen of history, and talk about how, oh, the writers write about the swordsman rather than the other way around. I invite you to think of the great swordsmen of history. We've got, Achilles and Hector, we've got Three Musketeers, Robin Hood, Puss in Boots. Creations of penmanship. These people would not exist without pens. And even the great swordsmen who did exist, we only know that they existed because of the mighty pen. So the pen clearly has this effect that it can bring swords into being. So we wouldn't even know swords had existed if we lived in a non-literate culture, because swords don't really exist anymore because, well, frankly, they're useless. And the reason that we make films about them now is a sort of nostalgia for our Stone Age, pre-heavy weaponry past that has now rendered these things obsolete.
That's all the time we have. Students, you have another 5 minutes. Excellent.
Jumping on to the point of a shiv in prison. You stated that... Once again, as Gates stated, that would be unhygienic. You stated that if criminals were given the choice of what weapon they could use, that they would somehow still choose a shiv, but that's counterintuitive, because if they had the choice of any weapon that they could choose, why would they do something that could also be fashioned out of a toothbrush? Or, especially since criminals are always concerned with seeming so scary and intimidating, and I'm going to cut you so bad. It just doesn't make sense that pens and toothbrushes and other things that are quite breakable would be desirable. But going on, Napoleon was stated earlier as being creating one of the vastest conquests by the stroke of his pen. But as a matter of fact, one of the things that Napoleon is known the most for is his sword, which was said to inspire his different legions going into battle. So, there you are.
All right. Okay, so you mentioned, the David, and that David was this great poet, and he's more often depicted, at his desk than he is in action, which I would argue is not the case, because having taken a second-year art history course, which was really, really intense, you look at the Donatello and the Michelangelo, and, either it's a slingshot or there's a sword somewhere in there, and it's, it seems that that's more what people want to be depicting. And then there's also the Bible story of Judith and Holofernes, which really does feature a blade. And she basically just goes and chops this guy's head off, and it's, a story. Anyway, so, you mentioned that all of these, movies and things are written by screenwriters, but who do we remember in the movies? I don't know who writes half the movies most of the time. I just know the actors who are in them.
Subtitles do not.
Yeah. I mean, we're both pretty dyslexic, so it just confuses me putting around with that. They seem to just do all of the background work. They're not at the forefront of the action, so I think that point is moot. And you mentioned creating these stories of weapons of mass destruction. Well, that's interesting, but I think those stories tend to unravel pretty quickly, and it's just embarrassing for the people who are so yeah.
If I may. Here, sorry, could you hold this for a second? Yeah. Is anyone more afraid of this man right now?
You should be.
Clearly, demonstrations and actions speak louder than the words.
I was pretty scared, though.
It's not really helpful.
Anyway, I think the point is, how much damage does it do sort of right off the bat? I mean, I'd wager, I could make a confidence interval. I'm 95% confident that, 900 million people die on swords, or have died on swords in the past. And I actually came up with this. This is like a real fact. 100 people die from pens every year. This is true. And it's because they choke on the cap. So I mean, like, I don't know. You could die in battle, like face to face with your enemy, or you could die at your desk. Trying to get tenure or something.
And I would argue that, especially from the example that Harry Potter gave us, when Umbridge forced Harry to write, which actually caused him to bleed through his arm through small cuts, that was communication via magical sword. That the message was very clear. It was not just up on a blank piece of paper.
Okay.
As a closing, we would just like to state that those who can do with swords, and those who can't, well.
Cheer for the students!
Okay, so where did I want to start? I was interested, that you guys keep on emphasizing fear and striking fear into the enemy and all of the rest. And I wonder what makes you guys so hostile. That surely there are other ways to express might. And I mean, we talked earlier, you talked earlier, actually, you brought up seduction. And, what better way to seduce somebody than with a pen? And you mentioned, the might of the sword. First of all, rapist. And second of all, I think you'll find that there's a whole genre called love poetry, but there isn't a genre called love swordsmanship. And throughout history, we found that the poets are able to seduce while the swordsmen are off basically hacking each other's heads off. You might talk about the force of arms. Well, first of all, no warrior has ever conquered more than a small fraction of the globe. You'll find that Shakespeare is performed everywhere because the power of his pen was mightier than Alexander the Great and everybody else's. This might be a time also to bring up everybody's favorite war hero, Joseph Stalin. When asked to give some consideration for the Catholics within the Soviet Union, out of consideration for the Pope, he scoffed, saying, "The Pope, how many divisions does he have?" Thinking, the Pope doesn't have weapons, what good is he? But what the Pope had was a book that was written with words, incidentally, words that talk about Judith and Holofernes that we wouldn't know about them if it wasn't for people writing about them. And it seems like the power of this book has endured while the Soviet Union has collapsed because the Soviets relied on tanks, the Catholic Church relies on words, and that carries authority despite the fact that they can rape as many children as they want and people still think of them as moral paragons. Which just goes to show that if you've got a good book behind you, people will do whatever you say. Do you want to jump in there?
That's exactly where I want to jump in. But on the Soviet Union, by the way, too, it fell not from the weapons, not from the amassed attack from the USA. It started with solidarity. It started with peaceful protest, with the same sorts of might displayed by Martin Luther King Jr. or Gandhi. The might of the pen. And that's what held force to change those worlds. Those words they gave are immortal. They outlast any beheading or even any attack. You can't kill ideas with a sword. You can kill people, but not the ideas. Otherwise, with ideas around like telemarketing, rap music, there'd be a lot more bloodshed by me. A couple other points you mentioned I want to get back to too. You mentioned you don't know any of the screenwriters because they're in the background. Apparently I must have missed the credits where they listed all the swordsmen. I was reading those. And the pen, you asked about the pen being scary. You chose a person at random. Let me suggest that might have been much more scary. For instance, you put it in the hands of Stephanie Meyer. Do a lot of damage with it. I know, I think that's all I got.
Sure. How are we for time?
You have 1 minute.
Okay, another point worth talking about is the Mongols, who are famous for coming in with swords and weaponry and all of the rest. And it's worth looking at Chinese history. That the Yuan dynasty was founded by the Mongol invaders. The Qing dynasty was founded by the Manchu invaders. What happened to them? Well, it was interesting that they charged in with their barbarian swords and quickly found that they'd arrived in a civilization that was built on the pens of Confucius and Lao Tzu and all the rest, and decided this was a much better way of living, and they dropped their swords and adopted the way of the pen instead. And the same thing happened in Iran as well, that, Genghis Khan and Timur both charged into Iran and discovered Hafez and Said and Rumi and all the rest. And it's worth pointing out that pens have a civilizing effect, and the greatest swordsmen, as soon as they encounter the power of the pen, will immediately drop their swords and, well, become civilized. In fact, civilization itself could be said to have started from the pen, that before the pen you could only command as far as your voice reached. But with the founding of the pen, people were able to organize bureaucracies, centralize governments. That was the point at which, by the way, people were able to start building swords, because before then they didn't really have the technology or sophistication. But civilization really can be said to have begun with a pen, even though a couple of weeks ago I told my class it began with agriculture.
Professors! That concludes our rebuttals, and it's time for the gloves to come off. We can open the floor for 10 to 15 minutes of open mic debate, where each side can jump in at any time to offer a point, deliver a rebuttal, throw down on the other side by any means necessary. Our debaters have been thorough in their arguments, taking their time to produce strong points to counter Defoe. No. My guess is they're thinking, do we have what it takes to Darwin? Are swords enough to cut their claims in twain, or should we Shakespeare's in their face? At any rate, my guess is these two teams will have you rowling in the aisles before one of them hits a homer. If not, or well, they'll always have their good looks and charm. Debaters ready? On guard.
Well, I'd like to start by taking off my proverbial gloves, as he suggested, and slapping you in the face, challenging you to another duel. And preferably following that up with some actual point. Dr. Lazinski, you stated that ideas have outlasted all of the beheadings that swords have caused, and that's kind of the point, that once you cut off someone's head, they're done, they're not able to give more ideas. It's not quite so simple to take a pen and lob off the frontal cortex of an idea. We're really just trying with the large pieces of metal that we can, and it's proved effective.
I know, every one of those have been beheaded. One that you've lost, you only know about those because you've read. I mean, how many beheadings have you observed in the last week?
I'm still trying to cope with that one. But you mentioned, the Mongols. You see, people just dropped their swords when they saw the pen. Like, oh my God, I'm fighting here. I need to do this. And I'm not sure quite think that's how it happened. And also, I mean, maybe they tinkered around with writing for a bit, but I think, when an enemy army comes to call, they're not going to go grab their pens. Like, they're gonna come back with their swords.
At the same time, I would like to point out that if you look at the structure of an army, you've got the grunts out there on the battlefield with their weapons, but the higher up in the echelons you go, the more pen wielding there is and the less weapon wielding there is, which suggests, to me at least, that weapons are for the relatively weak, the ones who don't have the authority to use pens. And as soon as they work their way up the ranks, then they're sitting in an office pushing paper and letting other people do the hacking to pieces.
Well, it's quite the fact that we believe in the power of the people, and in this case, the power of the students. So I would actually, it's logical that we're in defense of the grunts, and it's understandable that from your higher positions that you would endorse some kind of hierarchy where we need to maybe write multiple papers in order to get through a longer series of year terms.
5,000 words.
Taking it at some points unnecessary steps. And that's actually interesting because it's a point that you've largely ignored for the breadth of this debate. I'm sure that if Ramirez was here, he would be standing up crying foul that the repression of the students has not been mentioned.
Let's go back to the students then, shall we? You guys are all here, and first of all, I think all voluntarily, not only here but at this university, paying good money, I should add. Thank you. An education that will catapult you into the ranks of the middle class, because you don't actually want to be out there doing brute labor. You want to be doing things that require less effort and earn you more pay. And usually universities train you to use these things so that you can get away with that. We're letting you in on a really sweet gig here.
Sounds very much like a pyramid scheme. And not speaking ill of any of my peers, because it's also my illness as well, but I would say that I've been brainwashed after 12 years of education, being dismantled from my sword and not being able to reach it, just being out of grasp, and just having all these piles. Everyone hands out free pens, and I just don't see it.
Also, you mentioned Shakespeare. Shakespeare.
Not Shake's sword.
Spear and a sword are not such different things.
No, however, if he had spent his life doing this with a spear, we probably wouldn't have heard of him. Which we might have done, but for very different reasons.
But I think the characters he's writing about, that is what they're doing, though. Like, there are sword fights on stage.
Well, it's interesting. So Hamlet famously concludes with a sword fight. I might point out, by the way, that it's poison and not the sword that does the killing. But then Horatio wants to cap himself off, and Hamlet says, "No, you must live to tell my tale." And if we didn't have somebody who lived to tell that tale, we wouldn't have Hamlet, and all that sword fighting would have been for nothing. Also, it's a play, it's...
Buy a pen. There you go.
Well, I hate to not jump away from Shakespeare and to bring up a more serious point, but Shakespeare himself, there's quite a bit of debate as to was Shakespeare actually a single person, or was he a collective of different bards working around the same time? Whereas Alexander the Great, Napoleon, great sword wielders of our time, they're not recognized under some umbrella name of Shakespeare. We know the individual. We have portraits of them, not some best guess at what a man in a froofy frock.
Well, in spite of your advocate for the pen and for the sword, and students picking up the swords, I will suggest too, as you're looking at future career paths, have a talk with all the swordsmen that have graduated.
We're not letting them.
Oh yes, that's right. We cut the Department of Swordsmanship. Not really a high demand occupation at this point in time, anyhow.
Well, actually, speaking back to the Mongols dropping their swords in spite of a pen, I do understand that within Japanese culture, one of the highest remaining parts of their heritage and culture is the sword master, who's actually given lucrative pay to just practice the art of finely tuning any kind of samurai blades, and must pass down to his apprentice. And that's still a practice in culture because they recognize it as a mighty part of their past.
And calligraphy.
I shouldn't say too shabby.
Is a pen made in a forge?
You got me there.
Something like the one ring of Sauron had to be destroyed because of all of its might in the hottest fires of all Middle-earth. So must a sword be made in a forge, while a pen can be assembled. Well, this isn't a pen. Whereas a pen can be assembled by any old factory worker in any kind of sweatshop. I said it. All taking it.
This is precisely the power of the pen, that they're cheap, they're, like the AK-47, which makes the sword obsolete. They're cheap to make, quick to assemble, and that means they can spread everywhere and have a great deal of influence. Whereas swords have to be made by hand, and this is one of the reasons why nobody uses swords anymore. They just are not good technology.
But, yes, so, we have so many pens. Everyone has a pen. So, can you imagine, what kind of crap gets written? Stephanie Meyer, which I'm offended by because that doesn't speak to me at all. Pens are accessible, whereas, the sword is an elite weapon. And, there are swordsmen today. People do fencing. It's a thing. And I think if you are doing fencing, it's, to learn discipline and that sort of thing. Whereas, I don't know who learns calligraphy. Maybe they do, but that seems a little strange to me.
If Stephanie Meyer is not for your company, let me suggest something else just as frightening with the pen. More intimidating, I think, than any sword. More disturbing, anyhow. Walking by, just 5 words, walking by a bookstore, I'll tell you what I saw. I saw A Sure Thing by Snooki. If that doesn't curl your blood. I mean, I don't know if that counts as a pen if it's written in crayon.
But that's just driving toward my point. I mean, like, how mighty is it if Snooki can do it? I don't know.
Snooki probably couldn't lift the sword.
This raises a question. I mean, I feel like, as the one with the philosophical training here, I just have to raise a point of logic. I know that might be a sort of a silly thing to do when faced with such illogic, but on one hand, you seem to be defending the sword as this elite, mighty weapon, and yet you were also defending the student swordsman as the masses, the grunts. I'm not sure how you square. I mean, are you defending the elite or are you defending the masses? Because you can't do both.
Well, actually, as a point of clarification, we're defending the elite weapon that has made itself enabled to any Joe who is willing to practice hard enough to master it.
And there is the power of the pen.
I don't.
Are really available to any of the students who care to try to master it.
And I would like to...
I'd like to add... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Is there any cultural taboo against crossing pens?
In British Columbia, there is yes.
How about crossing swords? That is going off the sexual innuendo. Clearly, my head is the only one still in the gutter because it was all gone by a sword.
Also, you mentioned the Bible a while back, which, anyways, I mean, you said that this is this book that, has influenced all of these people, but how did it, it was written down, but at the same time, how did it get its significance? It was, through the Crusades, through battles, which meant that Catholicism became sort of, this dominating faith. So
the Jews were actually using the Bible a long time before. And to that point, I might add that the Jews are often called the people of the book, because despite centuries of slavery, oppression, repression, they outlasted all of their conquerors and invaders because they have this book that kept them going. And maintained a sense of cultural cohesion and identity, while the Philistines or whoever else went and got beaten up and lost their sense of who they were.
I'm not really strong, but I don't think the Crusades, I think they did about more killing than successful converting. I think that the strengths of it were marred, I would say, by the use of the sword in that realm.
David, at the beginning of this debate, you were described as being handsome gentlemen, good physical features. So, one term.
Read my writing.
One term often described that could even be described to represent the two of you is cut. Depending on how often you go to the gym. Would anyone ever prefer to be described as stenciled?
sketchy.
I'm a very good listener. Picture books up.
I'll tell you the truth, I don't really spend much time in gyms, but the last time I did, I didn't see any swords around. But I don't just sign in with a pen.
Well, they're afraid of you bringing a sword. It's so mighty.
It's so mighty, nobody uses it.
It's the levels of the repression, it's everywhere. It started in the schools. It's really the schools we need to change.
It's so mighty they had to stop it by writing laws.
Anyways. Going back to the Bible. Burning me, but anyway. Any religion, though, has a text that goes with it. Confucius had the Analects, and there was the Tao Te Ching, and, there were all of these things that, were present in ancient society. So, but what determines which one becomes, victorious? They all come with this deep tradition. And I think, to carry it out, you need to have survivors, and to survive, you need to kill, the people
Bible, which is, post-David, or post-Solomon at least, a long history of decline, oppression, defeat, where the people who are being defeated, because they don't really have much talent with swords, continue to survive, outlast their opponents, because they have the power of the pen.
You know what's really too bad? In my bag, I have a sheet of quotes from the Bible that have to do with swords.
Oh, were they written down?
They're typed out.
Laser printer.
And, yeah, I wish I had them. But if I did, then I could trash you.
This debate has been long, fellows. We're down to the final round where each side gets to present closing statements.
That's a pen that strikes me.
It is a mechanical
Anyway, we're down to closing statements. You each have 5 minutes. Professors, you go first.
Ultimately what we're trying to say is that swords have the power to destroy, we grant that, but only pens can create. And once you've done all your hacking and chopping, what you come right down to is, okay, what are we going to do now? And to build things, nobody builds with swords, they build with pens. They don't literally build with pens. We've come together this evening for a debate. And debates are institutions where we set aside brute force when we're combating each other, instead to use words. And I would like to suggest that it's a presupposition of this debate in a way, that the pen is indeed mightier than the sword, or else we wouldn't be having this debate. We've acknowledged in a way that the power of the word has its place and is indeed a superior or more cultured institution than one of simply smiting at each other, in which case you'd also lose. Pens as creative implements, they're the ones that write the laws, they're the ones that found civilization. To quote from the Monty Python and the Holy Grail, you can't expect to wield supreme executive power just because some watery tart threw a sword at you. I mean, if I went around saying I was emperor just because some moistened bint had lobbed a scimitar at me, they'd put me away. No, supreme executive power lies in the authority of the pen. Sorry, I'm just stealing all your points.
No, they're your points. Go ahead. That was your wrap. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. So swords are a means to an end, but the pens are the ends in themselves. So I mean, as somebody who has done a PhD in philosophy, I can tell you that Aristotle, Plato, all the great philosophers have these intricate arguments for why the life of the mind is the highest form of life. The life of the mind is one that is connected to the written word and connected to pens. And I don't think you would find a single philosopher, even Nietzsche really, who would say that the highest life is the life of the sword. And even if they were to say that, they would need a pen to say it. Is there anything else you'd like to?
No, I think you nailed it right on the head. That's our final point.
Okay, so I think we finished skewering you. And we turn it over to you.
Well, obviously we're going to move on to our own points, but just before that, I would like to ask, which of the philosophers, or if any of them, were practiced sword masters, or were they simply trying to tout their own brains and their PhDs in order to, in their own kind of compensation, if you will? As well as the Monty Python skit that you mentioned, I do believe that it was the king speaking down to the peasant who was managing filth at that point, who had been speaking to him about scimitars and moistened bits. So I think we can see, in that case, who was mightier and who came out on top, regardless of any kind of coconut horse that... So what have we talked about today? We've talked about how taking the sword away from all of us has really just... It has sucked. Having to go through school without a sword. Imagine how much more fun you could have in snowball fights if like Peter Pan from Hook, when the coconut is thrown at him, all of a sudden he grabs out a sword and slices it in half. If that were a snowball. And argument snowballing further, handing it over to Kate for a moment.
That was a weird point. But so you said, in coming here, we're assuming that the pen is indeed mightier than the sword. But that's not true. We're just trying to get on, the same ground here. We wanted to bring swords, but Daniel said that we couldn't. And I wasn't able to get one because they wouldn't sell that to me. But, anyways, I think that if we did have swords, though, I mean, that really wouldn't be fair to you guys. So, you know, there's a reason that they didn't give it to us. And it's because, you know, it would have meant a definitive win.
And as long as we're talking about, you know, more than just the physical ramifications of a pen and a sword, speaking about language, just kindly remind yourselves all the different kinds of words, glorified words that used to describe a sword, whereas we have a bic and a proquill and a nib. You don't clip your sword onto your belt like some middle-aged man with a cell phone. You have a exactly. You have a broadsword, a scimitar. The Highlanders used to have meter-long swords that they would swing above their heads, and even their friends behind would get lobbed off. I feel like the whole room is expecting me to speak more.
2 minutes.
Of course.
I would, in closing, well, not in complete closing, but if you look at this random object.
That's what Bible quotes are.
It would have been helpful if I walked over here beforehand. If you notice the Canadian maple leaf, the ends, they don't look like pens. They look like the sharpened blades of some wicked war instrument that would have been based off some form of sword. Here you are, just in case your words didn't adequately describe the shape of a maple leaf.
Okay.
You can go. I'm just getting into ad hominem.
Okay. You know, if we're talking about power, you know, if you're knighting someone, you don't knight them with a pen. You knight them with a sword. So that seems to be kind of... Pardon? Nib. But yeah, like, it seems that the sword is really, you know, the article through which power is transmitted, so... In a lot of different ways, right, Michael?
Exactly. You're not going to be impressed when someone swallows a pen, but if someone is able to shove a throat down their sword... If someone is able to put a sword halfway down their throat and come out better on the other side, or maybe even cleaner on the other side, that is might there. That is might.
Does our McMaster symbol have a sword in it? I wish it did.
That concludes our debate. Let's have another round of applause for our... There will be a poll on SAS.
But first, an unofficial applause-o-meter, which doesn't
But
actually
first, an
count.
unofficial applause meter. So, who thought that the professors spelled out the best arguments? Who thinks the students have the more piercing wit? Unofficial clap-o-meter says the students win this debate. The official poll will be on SassWeb.
Club.